Welcome back to Leaders, a podcast dedicated to exploring the best leaders this world has ever seen. Before diving into today's episode, wanted to acknowledge that today will be podcast number 10, so we'll be going into double digits here, which, understanding the podcast ecosystem today, it's estimated that there are 3 to 4 million podcasts, of which about 44% of them, only 44% of them have more than 3 episodes. And then once you get into 10 episodes, that number dwindles to 720,000. So proud to have produced this being the 10th episode and hopefully many more to come. Have been creating some leadership graphics on past episodes and posting them to the channel, and so hope you've been enjoying those. Continue to kind of pursue that as part of the content being pushed out for each episode. And today, as part of episode 10, excited to dive into a well-known management and leadership expert that has served as CEO of Intel, and that is Andy Grove. And so I first came across Andy Grove in my first leadership deep dive, and really understanding and reading the most impactful books that I had seen in some searches, and one of those being High Output Management. Certainly the first time around reading it, definitely gleaned a lot of insights, and I felt like Andy was one who had lots of detail and articulated a certain distinct management style that he adopted through his years at Intel and as CEO, and one where it wasn't as generalized maybe as some others that had written through books. He really articulated and detailed out some of his principles and some of the ways that he liked to operate as an executive. And so I found that very fruitful, and so it was a logical place to start here, and he was had been on my list. And then as we studied Steve Jobs in episode 2, he came up again within that. And so it is really, I think, relevant that he was an executive that has developed out these management principles to be studied in that book, as well as he had 2 others that he had wrote. And he does have an interesting personal history that is traced through these 2 books as well. So one being Swimming Across, and the other being Only the Paranoid Survive. And so those 2 books also referenced within this episode here. And so let's dive in to Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. And we will just start here with a description of his rise to the CEO path. So Andy started out as a researcher at Fairchild Semiconductor, where he worked on the development of integrated circuits. 1968, he co-founded Intel, quickly rose through the ranks to become the CEO in 1987. As CEO, he led them through a period of tremendous growth and innovation, created with developing the company's TikTok, not to be confused with their the modern social platform, but the TikTok strategy, which included alternating between the development of new generations of microprocessors and the optimization of existing generations. And so this strategy helped them to stay ahead of the competition, maintain its dominance in the semiconductor industry. Also a strong advocate for continuous improvement, coined the phrase constructive confrontation to describe the importance of open and honest debate in the workplace. Also introduced the concept of management by walking around, which involves spending time with employees and getting their feedback on how to improve the company. brief description before we dive into it later, but his leadership style was demanding but also effective, known for his bluntness and willingness to challenge the status quo. He was also a great listener, though, and a mentor to many of the employees at Intel. He retired from Intel in 1998, continues to be active in the business world. He's obviously written several books and served on boards of several companies, including Google and Apple. Overall, just a brilliant engineer, leader, really a pioneer within the semiconductor industry. And he was their first COO at Intel. He became president of Intel in 1979 before taking that CEO spot in 87. And he served in that CEO spot until 1988, where he retires from Intel. And he passed away at the age of 79 in 2016. So just a general overview there of his career, what he was kind of known for. And so to really hone in on that now, let's go into more of his leadership style and really his unique combination of blending on leadership, strategic planning, and execution was how he was viewed as a leader. And really, he starts off in saying that a leader must identify SIPs, which are strategic inflection points, which arise when there is an order of magnitude change in a company's environment. So CEOs can do this with a 6-force framework that relies on customers, suppliers, competitors, potential competitors, providers of substitutes, and a frenemy group called complementers. He also encouraged leaders to make a decision at these inflection points. One other thing with the inflection points and what he stressed was experiential learning. So a focus on recruitment and team building, including the importance of feedback in a one-on-one setting. He was able to create a framework that leveraged both his experiences and his need for structure in order to assess progress and adjust his approach, the art and science of management. And so now we will get more into the art and science of management and his kind of other thoughts and commentary on teams and management. And so one of the other ideas that he has is that the work of a business, of a government bureaucracy, of most forms of human activity is something pursued not by individuals, but by teams. This idea is summed up in what I regard as the single most important sentence of this book, High Output Management, that he's referencing here. And so he emphasizes this multiple times throughout the book, and I think it is a succinct yet very impactful way of looking at what the role of management ultimately is and the definition of it. And so he says the output of a manager is the output of the organizational units under his or her supervision or influence. And high managerial productivity, he argues, depends largely on choosing to perform tasks that possess high leverage. A team will perform well only if peak performance is elicited from the individuals in it. A few questions he likes to ask are you adding real value or merely passing information along? How do you add more value? By continually looking for ways to make things truly better in your department. You are a manager. The central thought of my book, again, is that the output of a manager is the output of his organization. In principle, every hour of your day should be spent increasing the output or the value of the output of the people whom you're responsible for. Second question is, are you plugged into what's happening around you? And that includes what's happening inside your company as well as inside your industry as a whole. Or do you wait for a supervisor or others to interpret whatever is happening? Are you a node connected to a network of plugged-in people, or are you floating by yourself? Third, are you trying new ideas, new techniques, and new technologies? And I mean personally trying them, not just reading about them? Or are you waiting for others to figure out how they can re-engineer your workplace and you out of that workplace? When a person is not doing his job, there can only be two reasons for it. One, the person either can't do it or won't do it. He is either not capable or not motivated. This insight enables a manager to dramatically focus his or her efforts. All you can do to improve the output of an employee is motivate and train. There is nothing else. A common rule we should always try to heed is to detect and fix any problem in a production process at the lowest value stage possible. Again, back to leverage here, he should move to the point where his leverage will be the greatest. As you can see, much of my day is spent acquiring information. Reports are more of a medium of self-discipline than a way to communicate information. Writing the report is important. Reading it often is not. A great deal of a manager's work has to do with allocating resources, manpower, money, and capital. But the single most important resource that we allocate from one day to the next is our own time. How you handle your own time is, in my view, the single most important aspect of being a role model and leader. Managerial productivity, that is, the output of a manager per unit of time worked, can be increased in three ways. 1. Increasing the rate with which a manager performs his activities, speeding up his work. 2. Increasing the leverage associated with the various managerial activities. Shifting the mix of a manager's activities from those with lower to those with higher leverage. And then before I kind of go into teams and meetings, just want to kind of reflect on that section. Lots to unpack there in terms of really, I think it's a series of a few different like sentence kind of statements that he's making in regards to management and where you should, I think a lot of the insight here is where you should spend your time or what you should really start to think about in terms of being in that role of management and where you have the most value and where you can concentrate your efforts in order to drive the impact and really go back to his statement of how do you measure the output of a manager? Well, it is truly just the reflection of the output of the organization or of that department that you are responsible for. So doing things and acting and spending your time wisely in terms of trying to acquire information, in terms of trying to set up people to enable them to get their work done. Really a big emphasis here on leverage as well. And so from a leverage and time perspective, for me, really goes back to what I have read from Naval Ravikant, who is a famous kind of angel investor and founder of AngelList, and he has lots of tweet storms and threads on what he describes as how to get rich, and he is always honing in on time and the framing of time and how that is your most highly valued resource and how to really leverage and spend that. And then just the idea of leverage as well. So going from things that are low to high leverage, I just see lots of parallels within Andy's commentary here to what I have read within that. So kind of just wanted to draw that parallel into that. Definitely some parallels too, and you can see that Andy Grove is a mentor and hero of Steve Jobs, just I think within what Andy is describing here in terms of his work philosophy, what he believes in, as well as what Steve articulated within his leadership style and interviews that he led at Apple. So direct corollaries there for sure, along with, a lot of the leaders that we've covered in the first 10 episodes here. So let's go back into So really, he was honing in on a lot of just managerial responsibilities and productivity. And then as it pertains to teams and meetings, he also has some thoughts on that. So he says, as a rule of thumb, a manager whose work is largely supervisory should have 6 to 8 subordinates. 3 or 4 are too few, and 10 are too many. This range comes from a guideline that a manager should allocate about a half a day per week to each of his subordinates. The 2 basic managerial roles produce 2 basic kinds of meetings. In the first kind of meeting, called a process-oriented meeting, knowledge is shared and information is exchanged. Such meetings take place on a regularly scheduled basis. The purpose of the second kind of meeting is to solve a specific problem. Meetings of this sort, called mission-oriented, frequently produce a decision. They are ad hoc affairs, not scheduled long in advance, because they usually can't be. He also says, avoid being in constant reactive management and focus on priority management, not time management. As Grove puts it, when you say yes to one thing, you are inevitably saying no to another. You can find yourself in meetings all day, every day, if you're not careful, but that's no way to be effective. At Intel, we use 3 kinds of process-oriented meetings: the one-on-one, the staff meeting, and the operation review. Remember Peter Drucker. He's a famed kind of management expert that I've read books on as well. Lots of great learnings from him as well, but he says that if people spend more than 25% of their time in meetings, it is a sign of malorganization. I would put it another way. The real sign of malorganization is when people spend more than 25% of their time in ad hoc mission-oriented meetings. Moreover, if we want to cultivate achievement-driven motivation, we need to create an environment that values and emphasizes output. If you accept that training, along with motivation, is the way to improve the performance of your subordinates, and that what you teach must be closely tied to what you practice, and that training needs to be a continuing process rather than a one-time event. It is clear that the who of the training is you, the manager. And then this next section is really a deep dive, more into, I guess, like the operationalizing / diagnosis of a production point that he identifies. So production points, he's identifying the operations in your work, most like process, assembly, and test production. And so he has some bullet points here that I just want to kind of outline within that that are good to kind of consider from a project standpoint in the considerations that he outlines here. So for a project you are working on, identify the limiting step and map out the flow of work around it. Define the proper places for the equivalence of receiving inspection, in-process inspection, and final inspection in your work. Decide whether these inspections should be monitoring steps or gate-like. Identify the conditions under which you can relax things and move to a variable inspection scheme. Identify half a dozen new indicators for your group's output. They should measure both the quantity and quality of the output. Install these new indicators as a routine in your work area and establish their regular review in your staff meetings. What is the most important strategy, plan of action you are pursuing now? Describe the environmental demand that prompted it and your current status or momentum. Is your strategy likely to result in a satisfactory state of affairs for you or your organization if successfully implemented? Leverage. Conduct work simplification on your most tedious, time-consuming task. Eliminate at least 30% of the total number of steps involved. Define your output. What are the output elements of the organization you manage and the organizations you can influence? List them in order of importance. Analyze your information and knowledge gathering system. Is it properly balanced among headlines, newspaper articles, and weekly news magazines? Is redundancy built in? Take a tour. Afterward, list the transactions you got involved in during its course. Create a once-a-month excuse for a tour. Describe how you will monitor the next project you delegate to a subordinate. What will you look for? How? How frequently? Generate an inventory of projects on which you can work at discretionary times. Hold a scheduled one-on-one with each of your subordinates. Explain to them in advance what a one-on-one is about. Have them prepare for it. Look at your calendar for the last week. Classify your activities as low, medium, high leverage. Generate a plan of action to do more of the high leverage category. What activities will you reduce? Forecast the demand on your time for the next week. What portion of your time is likely to be spent in meetings? Which of these are process-oriented meetings? Mission-oriented meetings? If the latter are over 25% of your total time, what should you do to reduce them? Define the 3 most important objectives for your organization for the next 3 months. Support them with key results. Have your subordinates do the same for themselves after a thorough discussion of the set generated above. Generate an inventory of pending decisions you are responsible for. Take 3 and structure the decision-making process for them using the 6-question approach. And finally, evaluate your own motivational state in terms of the Maslow hierarchy. So just, again, he's jumping a little bit back and forth in terms of a lot of these bullet points that were highlighted within this production process, but a lot of these point back to questions you should be asking yourself as a manager and leader of an organization or of a department to regularly be doing these things and asking these questions to, I think, focus you and direct you on the right things that you should be prioritizing. So a great list of just key considerations that he outlines here. And with that, there's a lot of action within the bullet points that trigger and elicit a lot of thought and action that should prompt it. And so he says the greatest danger is in standing still. Never satisfied with any decision he made, he was kind of continuously trying to improve. The culture at Intel, in him instilling a lot of this, was known as a pressure cooker, but he also implemented a non-hierarchical workplace, as he is credited with being one of the first CEOs to sit in an office cube with his employees. He was also kind of this idea of staying cool under pressure. So a bunch of us in the press pit noted that Grove was being unusually talkative and congenial that day. He didn't run away after his keynote, and during the impromptu Q&A, there is a verifiable dearth of blunt, surly responses. Leaders need to be emotional. Grove had a legendary temper, and he could berate people for showing up late to work. But people who worked with him always held him in high regard. He gave off an undeniable charisma. He was funny. One former Intel exec described him as the person you would follow up a hill in a battle. He's also described as having a proclivity for confrontation, being rigorous, but also no nonsense. Pat Gelsinger, who was a former Intel executive at that point, who then went on to become CEO of VMware and is now back at Intel as CEO, describes sessions with Grove as dentistry without Novocaine. If you went into a meeting, you better have your data. You'd better have your opinion, and if you can't defend your opinion, you have no right to be there. On the other end, he also demonstrated humility as a leader. Only the humble survive and the complacent get killed. If existing management wants to keep their jobs when the basics of the business are undergoing profound change, they must adopt an outsider's intellectual objectivity. Also, don't be afraid of the future. The 1997 discussion revolved around whether or not Intel would produce microprocessor for desktops that cost less than $1,000. Believe it or not, that was a serious debate back then. Some analysts theorized that it would cheapen the brand and cut margins. Grove felt it was inevitable. So this, conviction for the future and where he saw the technologies as well as the industry going, is a common thread, I think, through a lot of these leaders. You look at Ray Kroc with McDonald's that we just covered in terms of the franchising model and how he was able to see ahead to see that that model, could succeed in the restaurant industry. Satya Nadella betting big on the cloud market as well as AI that is coming to fruition now. John Chambers comes to mind from a technology perspective of how he really led Cisco through a time of rapid change and really conviction on where the company should be positioned from a capital allocation standpoint too. So a lot of great parallels there in terms of Andy and the semi-processors and semiconductor space of where Intel could win. A few other quotes I just wanted to highlight as far as being ones that he's kind of known for. So before I mentioned that one of his books is called Only the Paranoid Survive. And so that quote is from that book, but it's also one of his most famous. It means that in order to be successful in business, you need to be constantly looking for threats and opportunities. You need to be paranoid about the possibility of failure, and you need to be constantly innovating to stay ahead of the competition. Another one that elaborates on that a little bit: success breeds complacency, complacency breeds failure, only the paranoid survive. This quote is a variation of the last one, and it emphasizes the importance of staying vigilant even when you are successful. He believed that if you become complacent, you will eventually fail. The lesson is we all need to expose ourselves to the winds of change. So he said that in the High Output Management book, and emphasized the importance of being open to change. And he believed if you are not willing to change, you will eventually be left behind. From the book Swimming Across, he says the critical ingredient is timing. Timing in business, he believed that if you're not able to capitalize on opportunities when they arise, again, you will eventually fail. And finally, in a crisis, you have to act. Not knowing what to do is still better than doing nothing. And he really emphasizing the importance of taking action in a crisis. You only make the situation worse if you don't take action. And from a failure standpoint, that will transition into here. I think, namely, we kind of point to 1994. So when Intel recalled Pentium chips, it had a minor engineering flaw, but that minor flaw was at the cost of $475 million. It rebranded itself from an industrial company to a consumer products company with its Intel Inside campaign, but failed to recognize the power of the internet and consumer concern over the chips as part of this shift. A lot of what Andy emphasized is output. So with a lot of output, he's wanting to ship products as a part of that. And so inevitably, when you ship a lot of products and are moving really fast to the winds of change here, there's going to be processors that they developed that were flops. So a few of them here was the Intel 486 in the early 1990s. It was really plagued by delays, technical problems, failed to live up to expectations. The Intel Celeron processor, so late 1990s, they released that, which was a low-cost version of the Pentium processor. And then the Intel Itanium processor in the early 2000s was designed to be a high-performance processor for servers and workstations. However, it really wasn't received by customers, so it ultimately failed to achieve the success it was desired there. And so finally, we will again wrap up with our Mentors and Heroes section. So from a mentorship standpoint, so Andy co-founded Intel back in 1968, and his counterparts within that are Gordon Moore, who's was a brilliant engineer and visionary leader. He was a major influence on his thinking about business and technology. The other founder was Robert Noyce, and so he was another engineer, and he was a key influence to Andy as well as they were building the company. Eugene Kleiner, a venture capitalist who was one of the first investors in Intel as well, was a mentor to many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and he helped Grove to think about the big picture and to develop a long-term vision for Intel. Kleiner, you may know that that's last name sounds familiar, so that's Kleiner Perkins, a large, to this day, venture capitalist firm developed by him and his partner. Peter Drucker, who was mentioned before, was a management consultant and author, one of the most influential thinkers in that field of management. And his books and articles had a profound impact on his thinking about leadership and management. Not to mention that Andy himself also mentored people. So we mentioned Steve Jobs, episode 2, Larry Ellison, and Mark Zuckerberg, and Bill Gates are a few of the other names of which Andy has had an impact on as well. So high prominent CEOs that he's helped advise based on a lot of his leadership style and principles. Into heroes, he does mention his parents who were survivors of the Holocaust, really instilled in him a strong work ethic and a sense of resilience. His mentors taught him about the business, technology, and leadership, so mentors and heroes, one and the same. The people of Intel worked hard to make the company successful. And then another few famous historical figures that he references are Theodore Roosevelt for his kind of role model of leadership style, and then Albert Einstein, who was just a general pioneer in the field of science. So with that, as we wrap up Mentors and Heroes, we are also wrapping up this episode on Andy Grove. And really, as we look at Andy Grove and his lasting influence on not only Silicon Valley, the tech community, as well as entrepreneurs, founders, is really this sense of that broader scope, not only on technology, but I think a lot of the management principles and style and his articulation of how he thought about where to run the company and how to, I think are ones that I think can have strongly influenced through the book and through his writings of some key principles that have been adopted by many CEOs, I'm sure, across the nation, both present as well as past, and I'm sure future. Just a very strong kind of articulation on many facets of management and how people should look at it. So hopefully some great takeaways for you there on that specific piece that I did want to hone in on from this Leaders podcast on him and what he was able to implement at Intel. And so hope you enjoyed episode 10. We'll be back with episode 11 shortly. Thanks.